Welcome to my channel. In this episode, I'm going to talk about researching your idea for your fiction book, and I'm going to share my process for this step. And stay tuned to the end of the video for a pit stop. Welcome to episode 4 of my How to Write a Fiction Book series. My name is Shannon and I write under the pen name SD Houston. My debut novel comes out later this year on 1 November. In just 3 weeks, I'm going to reveal the cover right here on this channel. So look out for that episode on July 15th. For those who are new to my channel, I've only published in creative nonfiction. However, I have years of education and experience behind me. With a master's degree in writing, I taught college English and literature for many years, as well as running my own business as a writing coach, helping students and writers from all over the world. So let's dive in. Alright guys, a disclaimer first. The writing process is a truly unique art form that's different for every writer. So some of the things I may offer here may not work for everybody, it may not work for you, and that's alright because there's no right or wrong way to writing. And I would love to know what does work for you, so leave me a comment below. If you follow along for my first 3 videos, then you probably have an idea for your fiction book. But where do you go from here? Writing a whole book can be a daunting process, but by breaking it down into steps, it will become less daunting. It's like eating a pizza. If you have the whole pie in front of you, you're not going to shove the whole thing in your mouth, although it might be fun to try. Instead, you'll cut it up into slices. You also won't shove the whole slice into your mouth. You'll take it bite by bite. Similarly, we can and should break down writing a book into smaller slices and further into bite-sized chunks to understand our ideas better. So right now you have an idea, but you need to grow and develop it. And the best way to do this is through research. If you're like my students, the idea of research probably makes you groan. But this is a very important step, and there are 2 main reasons why research is important. So why should you do research? I have 2 important answers for this: believability and brainstorming. Let's look at why doing research adds to your story's believability and credibility. For nonfiction writers, this may be a no-brainer. You have to have the right facts and make sure that it lines up with the historical documents. However, this is just as important to fiction writing. But why? Research provides specificity, which is needed to make your writing more believable. Besides making the world of your book more believable and credible, research can help you in your brainstorming, offering more ideas and sparking creativity for your story. By researching, it can help you narrow down what you want to tell in your story. And this is all part of the brainstorming process. As you read, you'll start thinking about ideas. So maybe your idea is a murder mystery based on a news story. You'll probably have read that news story to find out more about the murder, and then you'll probably look for future news stories and glean whatever information you can about the people who are involved, their backgrounds, maybe what murder weapon was used, and other things like the location and maybe some motive. All of these things will help inform you on the story that you want to write. Not only that, but it may lead you to figuring out who your main character will be. There are 2 types of research I suggest you do. The first type of research is reading in your chosen genre, the genre you plan to write in, especially newer, successful works. Something I always shared with my students at the beginning of every semester was a statement from Stephen King in his nonfiction work On Writing a Memoir of the Craft. If you want to be a writer, you must do 2 things above all others: read a lot and write a lot. There's no way around these 2 things that I'm aware of. No shortcut. Of course, my students groaned because many could care less about becoming a better writer and cared more about passing my class. But for you, this should matter. You want your story to resonate with readers, so it's useful seeing how successful authors accomplish this. I know there are a lot of people who say we already read a whole lot in our everyday lives, why do we need to read more? And I think maybe that makes sense from a grammar and sentence structure, because we do read lots of emails or text messages, and so we have an idea of how the English language is put together. However, I think that you still need to read for one very important reason. You need to read in your genre because, as I mentioned in a previous episode of this series, you need to know what the genre conventions are today, because readers know, they're savvy enough to understand the differences between different writing styles and whether or not it falls in line with what they're expecting. This research is important in understanding what you need to write in order to sell to the market. Now let's talk about the second type of research. Research the setting. Next is researching your setting, and this can help you further your idea, not just to know what the setting will be, but it will also inform on your characters, the people who inhabit your world. You have an idea for your fiction work, but you need to narrow it down to a specific time and place, the when and where. This is the setting. See if you can narrow it to an exact date and location. If you don't know the specifics yet, try to narrow it down to maybe the country, the province, the state, some smaller location than the whole world, and try to pick maybe a time period like the 50s or 60s or today. Then start reading in that location and time period. For example, going back to that murder mystery idea, if the news story came out of Chicago in the 1920s, then you have two key pieces of information. You would research Chicago in the 1920s. Important things you need to know include clothing, technology, language and speech patterns, culture, government, religion, and anything else specific to that time period and location. All of this can inform on your story's plot and its characters. And speaking of characters, it's important to note what names are popular during the time period and location where your story is taking place. Now, if you're writing fantasy or science fiction or any genre in which you are making up an entire world, you still need to know this information, if not more. Your story will still need to have culture and history to make it more believable for your readers. Whether you make this completely up, you entirely fabricate everything, or you can base it on real events and settings in our history. This is what George R.R. Martin did with his Game of Thrones series by basing his story on 15th century England and the War of the Roses. As you know, I write fantasy, and to complete my thesis for my master's degree, I wrote a fantasy-based novel set in an entirely made-up new world. And this came in about 300 typed pages, but before I actually wrote it, I wrote a 100-page history of my world, which included the cities and towns and the geography around them, and cultures, government, and religion by region, as well as each city's major imports and exports. All of these things are important to societies. So to make your world as believable as possible, you want to know how it all works. And even if you're not making up a completely new civilization, you need to understand the setting your characters will inhabit. So I learned early in my career of teaching that even though my students groaned at the idea of doing research, starting the actual work was a daunting idea to them. So they would start doing their research and keep doing research. So I learned to give them a warning. Careful that you don't do so much research here that you never start writing. And the best way to do this is to give yourself a time limit. And you do want to think about this time limit by thinking about how much time it's going to take you to read and find sources and take notes. And on the idea of taking notes, how do you take notes? For me, I started off in notebooks. I hand wrote all of my notes from my sources because I wasn't really sure what I was going to use. So I wrote everything that I thought was interesting. Later on, when I started whittling down my idea and solidifying what I was actually going to do, I transferred a lot of my handwritten notes to Word documents, and I just transferred what I knew was going to be important for my story. I know a lot of writers who use Word document. They also use Google Docs, and then Scrivener is like a huge, big tool that a lot of writers really appreciate. I tried out Scrivener once, and it wasn't really for me, but it is very beneficial for many writers, so it might be something you want to check out. However, back to time limits. The time limit you set for yourself is going to depend on you and your lifestyle. You may set it as a week, a month, or even a year. And again, this just depends on you and what you have going on in your life. However, I do suggest strongly you set that time limit and you stick to it. How I did it. I set my initial time limit for 2 weeks. But note, as you move through the writing process, you may have to go back and do more research, which is okay. You set that time limit to stop your general research. As you start solidifying your idea, you may think about places where you need more research, but now when you go to do that research, it's very specific. You know exactly what you're trying to find out. And so the tools that I used were my notebooks where I took my notes, and I used primary sources, secondary sources, tertiary sources, and fiction sources. And let me break those down for you. I kept 2 notebooks. The first one I used to take notes from most of my sources. The second one was for more specific notes on the Irish deities, their lands, their magical artifacts, and their relationships. For me, my primary sources were those that offered the most direct evidence of my setting and culture, as well as the original story of my fairy tale retelling. The first is Mythic Ireland by Michael Dames. The author paints a compelling image of Ireland's geography and living myth based on archaeology. And so I was able to use this source to narrow down exactly where I wanted my story to take place. I was really intrigued by the author's writing about the province of Munster, and specifically County Kerry, where my story ended up taking place. I was very drawn about the tales the author collected from people who lived in that region, and it did help inform me on a character that I wanted to add to my stories, and that was the character of the Morrigan, because there were a lot of tales about her in County Kerry. If you saw my second episode in this series, then you know I gravitated toward a retelling of Snow White and Rose Red. Now, I've read all the versions of Snow White and Rose Red, but the best known story is the one from the Brothers Grimm. I had read the story of Snow White and Rose Red in a book as a little girl, but for this research I found a copy of it online, as well as other versions by other authors and sources. So what I did is I summarized all the different stories from the different sources. I also looked up reviews of the story online, and I took note of what people said about the stories. And it kind of informed me on what I might want to add or take away or keep for my retelling. And this really led to an aha moment for me, because one reviewer talked about the red herrings in the story. And one particular red herring was the idea that Snow White and Rose Red were close sisters. So it kind of set up this idea that they were going to be separated at some point, or that their mother was going to have to choose between them, or that fate was either going to lift up or destroy one of them. And that never happened in the original story. So I knew, I can do something with this. And this led to my favorite question, what if? What if the sisters were forced apart? That is the end of my primary sources. Now we have my secondary sources. For me, these are my secondary sources because I weeded out the information I needed from these works. The first of these is Lady Gregory's Complete Irish Mythology. She wrote this text from the translated sources, filling in where the texts were not complete. She tried to stay as close as possible to the original translation. Lady Gregory's work was all about the supernatural race representing the main deities of pre-Christian Gaelic Ireland, and it talked about each of the characters' origins and their relationships to each other and the different battles that they faced. And of course, these were the deities who were later relegated to fairy status, yet this work actually showed me what the stories were before all that happened. My second secondary source is the Book of Fairy and Folk Tales of Ireland by W.B. Yeats. He draws on a variety of sources, mostly folk tales, with many of them not attributed to any one person, and with some content from earlier authors and writers. These stories come from the age after the supernatural deities, the Tuatha De Danann, had been relegated to fairy status, so the work is much different from Lady Gregory's text. There weren't very many dwarves in Yeats' stories. In fact, there was only one story about a dwarf, which led me to think that perhaps I should make the dwarf and the Snow White and Rose Red retelling into a leprechaun, because many of Yeats' stories in his book were about leprechauns. And it did intrigue me about what the origin stories were of leprechauns, which was not in his book. I found that in other sources. But that helped me figure out who was going to be the leprechaun in my story, because one origin story of the leprechauns comes from one of the main deities of pre-Christian Gaelic Ireland. Well, and Yeats' stories gave me another aha moment of what I wanted to do with my story, because all these different tales about the leprechauns made them into people who were not very agreeable. They could get upset very easy, and they like to kidnap people. So they kidnapped people who did them wrong, or maybe they wanted someone for servitude. And there was even a story of a leprechaun who kidnapped somebody because he wanted a drinking buddy. So between my primary sources and these few secondary sources, I started forming an idea of what I wanted to do in my story. And this all led to the ungrateful leprechaun who the girls helped by cutting his beard, but that made him upset and he felt wronged. So then he kidnaps one of the sisters, which forces them apart. My last secondary source is Tales of the Elders of Ireland by Anne Dooley and Harry Rowe. This work is a complete translation of a late Middle Irish literary text with a name I will not even attempt at this time, but here it is on the screen. And this Irish text can be translated variously as Colloquy of Ancients, Tales of the Elders of Ireland, or the Dialogue of the Ancients of Ireland. And it is the largest surviving volume of work from 12th century Ireland. This book provided information about some of the famous heroes who roamed Ireland, as well as the Tuatha De Danann. Now let's move on to my tertiary sources. A tertiary source for me offers summary information found in the primary and secondary sources. These provided additional information on characters, places, and battles found in the Irish mythological world. For my research with the tertiary sources, I used a dictionary of Irish mythology and a dictionary of Celtic mythology. Note that Celtic mythologies include deities, themes, concepts, places, and creatures from all over Europe. But different regions will have varying stories and their own unique stories that don't cross over into other parts of Europe. So even though a dictionary of Celtic mythology included way more information that was needed specifically for Ireland, the book actually offered fuller and better references than a dictionary of Irish mythology. I also read several fiction books that I thought could help inform my story. The first was Fionn, Defense of Roth Blama by Brian O'Sullivan. O'Sullivan's novels was placed in the 2nd century Ireland, which was the kind of time period that I was thinking about for my novels. And he also covered like the tribe warfare and druids, which I thought was very interesting and helped to give me background information that I may not have found already in my search. The second book I read was Red Winter by Annette Marie. I really liked Marie's work because it was a deep exploration into the Japanese mythology. It moved beyond the Greek mythology that I was very, very familiar with, and it kind of gave me a different example of how to write about a mythology that was not Greek and how this could possibly work in fiction writing. Other fiction I read during this time period included George R.R. Martin's A Game of Thrones series. I studied his work because he was a successful fantasy author, and I thought I might learn something useful. I didn't. Our writing styles are totally different. Next, I read Hounded by Kevin Hearn. His book is based on Irish mythologies in a contemporary setting, and I was curious about his portrayal of the Irish deities. The last book I read was Spellbook of the Lost and Found by Moira Fowley Doyle. I was interested in this fantasy novel because it was set in Ireland and it was filled with magic and witchcraft, which I thought might help me understand a little bit about the atmosphere I'd want to create in my books. So my goals during my research process was that I wanted to stay as authentic as possible to early Ireland, which could be a bit difficult to do because the research during that time period is very little. But the stories, the tales were there. And from that, I gleaned like the specific language that was used during that time period, like similes, metaphors, and common phrases used by people in that time period. One thing I especially looked for were curses, because in the story of Snow White and Rose Red, the dwarf cursed quite a bit, and I wanted to carry that trait over into my leprechaun, but I also wanted to use curses that were a little more authentic to the Irish setting, something that came from the land there and the culture there. And I ended up incorporating some of these same lines and phrases into my story. Last, I also took note of like the characters' clothing and objects that they interacted with on a day-to-day basis, like what did they drink from, how did they eat, what did they eat. And I felt all of this was important in making my story believable and authentic to my readers. So those of you who may not be so much into note-taking, there are alternate methods, and some of these I did deviate into as well. It wasn't just all reading sources and writing down notes. I also watched a lot of documentaries, as much as I could find on the Irish mythologies. And there was quite a bit on YouTube, a lot of videos, especially like professors videotape their lectures on Irish mythologies, and I got a lot of information from this. You can also watch documentaries, and you might find some interesting facts slipping into your writing. Another option is to take up a hobby that would relate to your setting or your culture. When you do this, it becomes unconscious research. Examples include sword fighting, basket weaving, fencing, horse riding, martial arts, and many more. I have tried to learn a bit of Irish Gaelic as a side hobby, but I'm not very good at it yet. So after your research, hopefully your original idea has expanded, that you got a lot of great ideas from what you read, and perhaps leading you to find inspiration for developing your world to fit the scope of a whole compelling novel. I can't stress how valuable doing this research for your work is. Researching helps make your writing believable, and it can also expand your idea by sparking your imagination. I'd love to know your thoughts and comments on what you found helpful or what you would like to know more about. Please leave those comments below. I will be posting the next episode in this series next Tuesday at 11 a.m. and I stick around for the first half hour to answer any comments or questions that you may have. And now for the pit stop. In this episode's pit stop, you will be prompted to narrow down your setting to a specific time and place. There's also a place here to write down the sources you've read. Very important if you don't want to forget what you've read and where. And then there's a spot to write down any new ideas that may occur as you read through your sources. If you fill out the pit stop worksheet, I would love to hear about your successes, or if you have any questions, please leave all of those in the comments below. If you want to stay up to date with everything I'm doing, please consider subscribing to my newsletter. Newsletter subscribers receive access to the first chapter of my debut novel, Blood of the Lily, along with other exclusives and giveaways. Thanks for watching this 4th episode in my How to Write a Fiction Book series. If you like this content, give it a thumbs up. And that's it for today. Thank you for hanging out with me through this episode, and happy writing.